my name is Nikolaj Sorensen, and this is my family tree story. So starting on my mother's side, my grandmother was born in the south of China, near Guangzhou, I believe. She was the only daughter, the youngest of four siblings. And she and her family emigrated to South Africa when she was relatively young. They had family there in the town of Port Elizabeth. So she grew up in South Africa under apartheid. And, the way that sort of worked in South Africa at the time was there were blacks and whites and coloreds were sort of in the middle. And that group of coloreds included Asian people and mixed folk, like myself. So she was raised there and then eventually emigrated to London and was there for about a year, I think, maybe a couple months, and then moved to San Francisco, where she spent the rest of her life. She was following family around, perhaps avoiding a lover. Unclear what the actual story is there, but she met my grandfather in San Francisco. My grandmother's name was Florence Chang. My gungung, William Bill Chang, was born in Hawaii to Chinese parents. His mother was also born in Hawaii. His father was born in China. Grew up in Hawaii, the oldest of seven children, and went to China for a couple years in the middle of his childhood, and then came back to Hawaii. Eventually enlisted in the army, first as a cook and then as a translator, but he never saw active duty during World War II. Eventually, after returning to Hawaii, moved to San Francisco, lived in Chinatown, where he met my grandmother. The two of them got married and settled down. Eventually, when sort of the laws were relaxed and Chinese people were allowed to buy property outside of Chinatown, they bought up some property and landed on 36th in San Francisco, where they lived until they died. That's where my mother was raised with her two older brothers. My mom, Patty, grew up in San Francisco, and it was always kind of has always been a very free spirit and kind of does whatever she wants. And I think she gets that from my grandmother. So she grew up in San Francisco, went to Berkeley to study mass communications. She was the one of the first people in her family to go to college, and then went to Cambridge for a year. Ended up not getting her degree for various reasons. Came back to the Bay Area. Worked in real estate as an appraiser for a couple years, and then eventually decided to go back to school and went to Stanford to get her PhD in sociology. Her goal was to become a journalist, and so she studied sociology, thinking that it would be important for her to be able to learn about people and their backgrounds and learn how to talk to people, which is kind of a wild thing to think about for me because my mother has always been, in my eyes, so good at talking to people. I really feel like she can just kind of talk to anyone in the same way that my grandmother could. My grandma, especially after my gungung died, would go on cruises all over the world, but she would also just go to random places and stay in youth hostels, and she would make friends with young people and take them out for dinner and tell them her life story, and they were always fascinated, and they would tell her their stories, and so she would always come back with these great stories about people she met, and of course they loved her, right? A little old Chinese lady shows up and says, "Oh, let me take you to dinner." You're like, "Yeah, okay, sure. I'm broke. I'm staying in a hostel." But yeah, so then my mother, while she was at Stanford, met my father. So we'll go to his side of the family. The farthest back I can go there is my Olomo, my great grandmother, who I was fortunate enough to know and get to interact with several times before she passed. She lived in Copenhagen working as a florist and raised three children, I believe. I'm not 100% sure about that. One of whom is my Fatma, my grandmother, Anameta. In Danish, you sort of delineate your grandparents by their relation to your parents. So Fatma means father's mother. Fa is father, Mo is mother. She was raised in and around Copenhagen, and eventually married my Fafa, Oa Sorensen, who his parents were a school teacher and a school principal, I believe, at the same school. So he was sort of raised in an academic family. They were both sociologists, emigrated to the United States to do. My Fafa was doing his postdoc at Johns Hopkins, I think, and this was in the late '60s, I think, right after my father was born. So he is an only child and was raised kind of all over the place. Baltimore, Boston, Wisconsin, Palo Alto. We have this cool thread where both my dad and my brother went to only fifth grade at Nixon Elementary, which is down the road from where my parents live now. But he also, they lived in Germany and in Norway and, of course, in Denmark. So really all over the place. He was raised by these two academics, so it seems kind of natural that, he became an academic himself and went into sociology in their footsteps. When I was getting ready to go to college, I made some joke about how, I had to follow in the family business and study sociology, and both my parents with their doctorates in sociology were like, absolutely not. Do something useful with your life. So I studied theater. But they, so he went to school for sociology, went to Stanford to get his PhD, and that's where he met my mother. They say that they met in the avocado grove at Stanford. I've not found a grove. There is one tree, and I think that is what they meant. But I can see how a grove sounds a little more romantic. But so they met there, and they had sort of like a whirlwind courtship. They got engaged after like 9 months, and the story goes that they were going through the grocery store, and my dad pulled a chicken out of the freezer chest. And was like, "Oh, should we get a chicken for dinner?" And my mom was just like, "Stops." Goes, should we get a chicken? What is it like? She had this whole crisis. Like, what does this mean for us to get a chicken? What my dad's sitting there just like, I just want a chicken for dinner. And I was like, I don't want to get a whole chicken with anybody that I'm not going to marry. And one thing leads to another. They have this conversation. And my dad was like, well, do you want to get married? And she says yes. And so after 9 months, they were engaged, and they're still together. And I think it's a really sort of cute story that we do make fun of them for a lot. But I think it is very cute. So after they wrapped up their degrees, they moved to Hartford, Connecticut, where I was born in 1994. Shortly after that, moved to South Bend, Indiana, where my brother Benjamin and my sister Chloe were born. My parents' names are Jesper Sorensen and Patty Chang. I don't think I mentioned that. But they were both at Notre Dame. My dad sort of got tired of being at Notre Dame very quickly, moved on to Chicago Business School. So he would commute to Chicago a couple times a week, which I think is where I first sort of started. We would sometimes go to visit him after he was done teaching, and that would be sort of my first formative memories of Chicago, going to the Field Museum, which we called the Dinosaur Museum because who cares about the rest of it, frankly. And, there was the summer where Cows on Parade was here, and that has left sort of this indelible mark on my memory. But after that, we moved to Newton, Massachusetts. We lived just off Boston College campus where my mom taught and my dad was teaching at MIT. We're there for about 6 years, just enough to sort of have some formative experiences, become Red Sox fans. And then we moved to, we moved out there because my grandfather had my fafa had slipped on some ice and hit his head and was having a lot of health issues. So he died actually shortly after we moved when I was in first grade. But as a result of that, we were always very close. We've always been very close with my fafa, because we were her only family on this side of the ocean. And so we then, after a couple of years there, all moved to Palo Alto, to Stanford, where my parents both got jobs. I think my Fatma also taught for a year before she decided to retire. But that's where I sort of had the rest of my childhood. And, it's growing up mixed is always, I feel like, very weird, and it is a very unique experience to each person. Right? I think even my brother and sister have different experiences and different sort of relationships to their mixedness than I do. For me, it was very much something I didn't think about for much of my childhood. And it wasn't until I went on an internship to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Oh, there's the logo. where I was, in the room with other Asian American artists for the first time, sort of like actually like thinking about that as a category of like who I was and like something that could be important to me, and with other people who were exploring that lens. And it really kind of changed my life. I think growing up when you're half white in like predominantly white spaces, it's easy to just sort of be like, yeah, I'm white. I'm white enough, right? And like also I celebrate Chinese New Year, and that's not like not a thing that you really think about, right? Until you are sort of like consciously othered. And like especially then you move to California, right? Where it's like, oh, there's a lot of white people, there's also a lot of Asian people. So like whichever way you slice it, ain't no thing. And so it wasn't until I really started thinking about myself like as an Asian American person in the lens of my theatrical work and like my artistic practice that became really important to me, and that became something that I like realized like, oh, this is something that I could celebrate, and like that is worth celebrating, and so like as I've moved on from that point, it has become much more of a touchstone for my life and for my art. It's something that I think about a lot, especially after Trump was elected and we saw the rise in hate crimes against Asian American people. It was the first time I really felt like super unsafe just being in my skin, and it's always weird because I feel like I'm kind of white passing. Especially on paper, where my name is Nikolaj Sorensen, reads very white, unless I throw the Chang in there to seem more Asian. But that negotiation is always very kind of fraught. But yeah, it is something that I've tried to grapple with and tried to be cognizant of like how I move through different spaces, whether I'm moving through white spaces or predominantly like BIPOC spaces. BIMPOC, actually, I'd throw the M in there for mixed, because that's what I am, and it's complicated, and I'm constantly navigating that identity. But I'm grateful for it. I think it has really informed the way I approach the world and my willingness to embrace duality and the weird ways, the weird sort of cognitive dissonance that we are often asked to embrace, especially in this pandemic world. That is my family tree story. Thank you so much for listening, and I am grateful that you're now a part of it.